I want to do a more in-depth tutorial on this watercolor painting. I have already uploaded the fast version, but now I will slow it down a little bit and tell you in detail what I did step by step. So here is my painting with the lines all drawn out, and I'm going to do some masking. That's usually the first step that I do in most of my animal paintings. I use the masking for the whiskers and for the eyes, and sometimes if there's a highlight somewhere else in the painting, like in fur or on the nose, I will use masking for that. I use masking as sparingly as possible because it does tend to look stilted and you have to do a lot of softening at the end of the painting. So whenever possible, try to use more negative painting techniques, or you can even use a Sharpie white pen to get some details. But I do usually use masking in almost all my paintings though of animals. So right here I'm using a rigger, and what I do first is I get the paintbrush wet and I scrub it in soap, and then I dip it in the masking, and the soap helps the masking not stick to the bristles of your brush. And then I just use a really light touch and try to get as refined of a line as possible when I paint in the whiskers. Because what you see is what you'll get. So just be really careful with masking and try to get your lines as tiny and refined as possible when you're using the masking for whiskers. A lot of times, even when I'm using masking, I'll use negative painting in between the whiskers still if I can, and only rely on that masking if I absolutely need to. So that's something I've been doing more and more, is trying to rely more on negative painting and less on relying on my masking to save those whites for me. So I use the masking and then I allow it to dry for at least, I don't know, 5 minutes. It doesn't take long. And another note about masking, what I found is that if you leave it on the painting too long, like more than say a week, it hardens and it really sticks to the paper. So just keep that in mind. If you're using masking, you don't want to leave it on the paper forever, because it does harden and it seems to stick to the paper, and it's a lot harder, if impossible, to get it off. So here I want to kind of show you how I use my palette. I'm going to do a first layer, and as you know from watching my other videos, I use a lot of water on the paper. I use clear water to get the paper moist, and then I drop in the color. So a smart thing to do before you even start painting is to get your palette ready. Get all your colors softened and wet so that as you're painting you can just quickly pick up the watercolor paint and you don't have to scrub too much. And if you use like your nice sable brushes to scrub into dry watercolor paint, it can be kind of rough on them. So the more preparation you can do of your palette before you even start, the better. So just either use a spray bottle and get all your colors that you're going to use wet, or or you can even take it a step further and use a rough brush and scrub some of those paint colors that you know you're going to use a lot of. Get them wet. And that's just the technique I use because I use tube watercolor paint, but I put it in my palette and it ends up being hard. So it's just like using pan paint, the way that I use my palette. So as you can see here, I'm just getting the painting wet where I want to put my very first layer. And as you can see, I'm getting it wet over the lines of the outer edges of the cat into the background. And the more you can attach your subject to the background, the better. It'll just look a lot more painterly. So as you can see, for this first layer of watercolor paint, I'm not worried too much about staying in the lines. I'm just trying to get down a first few layers of paint and keep it really loose and soft. And some watercolor painters really, they get the whole paper wet and they'll put in like a whole wash of paint, a few different colors, and just really go crazy with this technique. But I usually don't, because I'm usually painting a little bit more tight than that because I'm doing portraits for people and usually they want it more realistic. So as you can see, I'm getting some burnt sienna here, getting some ultramarine blue, that's Windsor purple there, just to create a beautiful brown, cool brown for the fur. And I have been using Winsor & Newton Windsor Violet with burnt sienna a lot more recently. I just think they dry together beautifully. They granulate a little bit, and it's just a really nice effect. So I have been using Windsor Purple a lot more lately. It just adds a little bit more dimension to my brown. So I don't use a straight burnt sienna, which you may not know this, but burnt sienna really acts like a yellow when you're mixing it. So sometimes it doesn't really look like a yellow, but it actually is more of a yellow than a brown. So just keep that in mind when you're mixing. So, but although when you combine it with ultramarine blue, it just gets a little bit darker brown. It doesn't get greenish at all. So go figure. But as you can see, I'm just putting in that first layer of brown, that light brown highlight that is underneath the ears. And you can see I'm going really slowly because I'm trying to keep track of what I'm doing, looking back and forth to my reference photo even at this point. And you can see how wet I have it, because what I'm planning to do, what I'm going to try to do anyway, is to continue to drop in as much darker color as I can while it's wet enough that it can stay soft. So you can see his chin is white, so when I was putting down the clear water, I avoided the chin because I want to keep that really nice and white. And I also make sure that I never paint that clear water into the eye, because I want those eyes to be pure blue. And I don't want any of this brown, even if it's very light, to seep into those eyes, because it's so important to keep those blue eyes blue for these Siamese cats, Himalayan cats that have those bright, almost shockingly bright blue eyes. Now I'm getting more ultramarine blue. I'm getting some darker, colors. That ultramarine blue darkens the burnt sienna quite a bit. And see, I'm dropping it in that dark area of the cat's face to really get it nice and dark. Now, towards the end of the painting, the paint was acting weird. It's like the sizing was off on this piece of paper, or maybe I was on the wrong side of the paper. I don't know, but I don't know. You probably can't see that detail in this video, but sometimes your watercolor paper will just have bad sizing and it's not even useful. And in this painting, I really had to go back at the end of the painting and really get it really, really dark, because the paint was acting weird on the paper. So I don't know if you'll be able to see that as we go, but sometimes that sizing is just something's off about it. But for the purposes of this video, you probably can't tell. So I'm just going in, I'm trying to work as quickly as I can at this stage. This is a crucial stage. The fresher you, what I'm trying to say is the more you can get done in this first layer, the fresher your painting is going to look. So if you can work as quickly as possible and get the paint as dark as possible while the paper is still very, very wet. Now when the paper starts to dry, if you still work with a very wet brush in a drying paper, it will cauliflower. And if you have any experience as a watercolor painter, you know that. So you just have to be really careful to stop while you're ahead when your paper gets too dry for this stage. So I do try to work quickly, and that's another reason why you want to keep that palette nice and moist and ready to go before you start painting, and as you go to keep it moist so that you can really get some nice thick paint on your brush quickly at this stage, so that you can get as much done as possible before the paper dries too much to be workable. And really, as you can see, the cat's face has some very black places, but am I using pure black on his face? No, I'm not. I'm using burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. Why do I do that? Well, the reason is that, as you will see, they kind of granulate together and they make a more complex looking dark, and it's just more interesting to the eye to have that little extra complexity in the color. It just looks better. So most professional artists will mix their blacks. They won't use straight black. Sometimes I do use straight black when I just really want blacky black and I don't need it to be too complex. For whatever reason, I will use just straight black, but more typically I use my go-to combination of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. That's just my go-to, and sometimes add some Winsor violet to add even more interest. Winsor violet and Winsor violet and burnt sienna together, to me, are just so pretty. So I love to use that combination. Here I'm not using too much ultramarine because the black on this cat's face is very cool. So I just kept it to my old standard Winsor & Newton ultramarine and Winsor & Newton burnt sienna. And you can see there's a little bit of cauliflowering happening on the nose. That's okay. I'll go back in. And sometimes some cauliflowering can just add interest. So it's not the end of the world. You can see I'm trying to pull in some dark blacks into the eyes so that it's not such a hard edge between the top of the eye and the fur. But you have to be real careful with that. So just keep in mind to be careful with that. Now I'm pulling in some of the fur details and hoping that, you know, I won't have to do too much more on this layer. That's the goal, is to, at this very wet stage, just to have to do this once. But as it happened, the sizing of this paper was off, and I had to go back with several layers to rework this face to really get it to the level of dark that I wanted, just because the sizing was kind of off. So unfortunately, I did not achieve my goal of only doing this area of the face once, which usually I don't. I usually have to go in and do more. But you see how nice and soft that chin, the fur and the chin is. Here I'm putting in some clear water to push that dark back up into the upper lip. So what you can do is when you have a white area and you get bleeding of paint into that white area that you don't want, just put a puddle of water in the white area and let it ooze into the dark area, and it'll push back up into the dark paint and push that dark paint out of the area you want lighter. And also it creates a nice soft edge. Here I'm going in with some very thick, like creamy consistency, ultramarine blue and burnt sienna mixed very well on the palette first. You want to mix it into your paintbrush very well. And I'm just trying to get this area very, very dark so I don't have to go in there again. So this is like cream consistency paint that I'm putting in there now, and that my paper is still pretty wet. You can see how much it's still bleeding, and so I started with very wet paper because usually the paper would have dried by now, but I had it pretty almost dripping wet when I started with this first layer of the paint. Now that my paper is drying, I can do some smaller details. So what you'll see me doing is putting in very thick paint on the nose, and the paper is almost dry, but it's still wet enough that I can do some of these finer details around the eyes and around the nose, and it won't bleed as much at this point, but it'll still be soft. So this is a really sweet time to take the opportunity to put in some harder edged details, but still soft enough to not be completely crisp edged. So you have to work really fast in this stage, but if the paper is just slightly moist to the touch, you will know that you can go in and put these details. And the trick is to not have too much water in your paintbrush, to have a lot more paint in your paintbrush, because if you add a very moist brush to almost dry paper, it's going to cauliflower. And if you don't want that effect, then you need to make sure there's thicker paint in your paintbrush than there is the amount of water on the paper, if that makes sense. So I'm using this opportunity to put some of the details around the eyes, and I'm using a very thick mix of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna around the perimeter of this cat's face, around his eyes, and around his nose. And you probably have like 2 minutes when your paper's like this before it'll just be too dry. And see, now I'm going right up to the edge of where the blue is, so I'm pretty confident everything is pretty darn dry. And you can see it's hardly even softening at the edges now, because it's getting more and more dry. So, and you can see how I work in my palette. I'm really scrubbing that paint around on my palette and into my brush to get it really well mixed in with the water. And here I'm putting a very fine little detail around the eye. I do like to make a connection between the edge of the fur and the eye as much as possible. Just like you connect the main subject to the background, you can almost think of the eyes as a mini painting, and you need to connect the eyes in some way to the rest of the cat. And a lot of times that's through doing the pupils of the eyes. You can attach the black pupils to the black upper eyelid or eyelashes, and I often do that just to make that connection, and it makes it look a lot less stilted. Or just the dark lines that go around the perimeter of the iris, sometimes you can draw in the color that way, and you can see on this painting I've done that with the brown, and it goes right up into the edge of the pupil. So I'll do a separate video on the eyes of this painting, and you can see in greater detail exactly how I do the eyes for this cat.